Okay.
Thank you, Chairperson. Mr. Hardy, if I could direct your attention to your June 2017 pre-filed testimony, page 40.
Okay.
Starting on line 1, I'll read the question. Question: does ISO New England provide any additional insight regarding whether a consumption-based or generation-based account approach is most relevant? Could you read your answer starting at line 4 and slowly for the benefit of the stenographer?
Full answer.
Full answer.
Yes. On February 20th, 2017, ISO New England submitted comments to the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protections, in parens, MADEP, close parens, on Massachusetts' proposed rule change from a consumption-based approach to a generation-based approach under the Massachusetts Global Warming Solutions Act. Moving from a consumption-based approach to a generation-based approach will require that electricity produced in Massachusetts be shifted to other states. ISO New England found, page 1 in parens, that while improving carbon emissions within Massachusetts, such a policy could, quote, increase regional emissions and raise wholesale electricity costs because electricity production is shifted from Massachusetts to less efficient plants and likely higher emitting fuel sources in the region, close quotes. Such an approach is antithetical to the goal of reducing overall carbon emissions.
And your footnote 18 on line 12 references this February 20th, 2017 letter on ISO letterhead to the Mass DEP, and the letter is signed by Ann George.
That's correct.
And you provided a full copy of that letter to the EFSB.
I believe so, yes.
And as you say in your testimony, the ISO letter pertains to the draft version of the Massachusetts DEP regulations implementing the Massachusetts Global Warming Solutions Act. Is that correct?
Yes.
Is it okay if I refer to that statute as GWSA?
Sure.
Okay. And at the bottom of, I'm looking now at your Exhibit 5, Ann George's letter. Page 4.
Do I need the letter?
Well, it's on the screen here. I was going to direct your attention to the last paragraph at the bottom. The first sentence says, the ISO's analysis shows that the design of the proposed EGU limit regulation has consequences to Massachusetts and the other New England states due to the regional nature of the electric power system. Is that right?
Yes.
And that's the issue of leakage that we were talking about earlier with your hypothetical about the Connecticut coal-fired power plant.
That's correct.
Now, the Massachusetts GWSA contemplates a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions below 1990 levels of 80% by 2050. Is that correct?
I believe that's correct.
And the Resilient Rhode Island Act contemplates a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions of 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. Is that correct?
Yes.
And while there are certainly differences between the Massachusetts law and the Rhode Island law, that's a similarity between them. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, on the first page of the ISO letter, in the very first paragraph, line 5, Ms. George is making reference to the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court's decision in Kane versus Department of Environmental Protection. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And the Kane lawsuit was brought in Massachusetts by Conservation Law Foundation and litigated to the Supreme Judicial Court by my CLF colleague Jennifer Rushflow. Is that right?
I believe so.
And it's true, isn't it, that the Massachusetts GWSA regulations that Ann George was discussing in this letter have now been issued. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Isn't it a fact, Mr. Hardy, that the Massachusetts regulations under the GWSA explicitly uses production-based accounting and does not use consumption-based accounting?
I'm not sure. I don't believe so.
You're not sure whether or not the mass regulations under the GWSA use production or consumption-based accounting?
I did not, I'm not aware that they use production-based accounting.
Is that why at 10:29 today you told the board with great confidence that the mass GWSA regulations use consumption-based accounting?
That's my understanding.
I would ask the board respectfully to take administrative notice of the Massachusetts GWSA regulations pertaining to electricity accounting. Mr. Hardy, isn't it a...
Objection. I think if you're going to take notice of a regulation, you need to look, or you also need to notice the statute under which the regulation is adopted.
I have no objection whatsoever to that. Isn't it a fact, Mr. Hardy, that the reason that the Massachusetts GWSA regulations use production-based accounting and reject consumption-based accounting is that that issue was litigated to the Supreme Judicial Court in the Kane decision, and the court ruled on that issue?
Objection. We object that the Massachusetts regulations uses a production-based accounting method, just so that the board is aware of that.
Chairperson, we have in front of us a letter provided to the board as an exhibit to his testimony referencing the Kane decision. We have a witness who told the board that the mass regulations use consumption-based accounting. CLF is asking the EFSB to look at the regs. They were issued one way as a draft, and then they were litigated to the SJC. They were litigated to the SJC by CLF. And earlier today at 10:29, Mr. Hardy confidently told the board that those regulations use consumption-based accounting. My question in that context is not objectionable. My question was, isn't it a fact that the reason the Massachusetts GWSA regulations use production-based accounting and reject consumption-based accounting is because that very issue was litigated to the Supreme Judicial Court in Kane and decided?
Objection. Objection. If he has a question with regards to a specific regulation, he should show the witness the regulation. Mr. Hardy's testified he believes, in his general knowledge, that the consumption-based accounting is used by the state of Massachusetts. He's not an attorney. He was not involved in the Supreme Supreme Judicial Court litigation that Mr. Elm is referring to. We have a very different view of that litigation. Very different view. We do not believe that case stands.
Well, I think he can bring that up when you question the witness.
Before we get there, I'd like to ask the stenographer to read back Mr. Hardy's earlier comment about the Massachusetts regulations, which Mr. Shore just characterized as he believes in his general knowledge that that may have been the case. And I'd like to see what it was that Mr. Hardy actually said under oath in this room earlier today. Yes, and I believe, subject to check, that it was a question from the chairperson, and Mr. Hardy was talking about the Mass GWSA regulations immediately after he mentioned the Rhode Island, Resilient Rhode Island Act. But
depending on how you run the numbers, it's the mathematic policy decision to choose one over the other. Yes, that's an excellent clarification. It is, in fact, the states have gone through this exact discussion in that both Rhode Island and Massachusetts chosen consumption-based that relates to carbon measuring the carbon emissions.
did she have your statement correct?
She did.
But what you said about Massachusetts GWSA regulations is not true, is it?
I don't think I specifically said Massachusetts GWSA regulations. I
Oh,
don't think that was specifically in my answer, but yes, that was my understanding, that was my answer.
are you aware of any current Massachusetts regulations pertaining to carbon emissions in the electricity sector that use consumption-based accounting?
I believe I answered the question.
No, you said a moment ago that, well, that wasn't specifically GWSA, it could have been something else. And I'm asking you, sitting here today, are you aware of any Massachusetts state regulation pertaining to carbon emissions from the electricity sector that use consumption-based accounting?
I can't point to specifics. It's my belief that Massachusetts uses consumption-based accounting.
Could you, after you get off the stand, provide to the EFSB any current Massachusetts state regulations pertaining to carbon emissions from the electricity sector that support that position?
Objection. He's asking the witness a question. The witness answers the question. This is not an appropriate part of testimony to ask a data request for the witness to go do another analysis to prepare to supply later. Objection.
If he is aware of any regulations, he could provide them. I'm not going to ask you to go out and do the research to find it, but if you're aware of them, you could provide them as a record request.
Okay.
Earlier in your testimony today, Mr. Hardy, you talked about why it was important to view the electricity system as a regional system and climate change as a global problem. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And I said, we'll come back to that. And this is the time we come back to that. So let's look at your testimony on page 38. Page 38. and this is in fairness to you, you did raise these issues in your pre-file testimony, that the electricity system is a regional system, and the problem of climate change is a global problem. On page 38, line 21, the question is, does the construction and operation of CREC run counter to objectives laid out in the Resilient Rhode Island Act, as some objectors to the project claim? And your answer, starting on line 24, is absolutely not. The Resilient Rhode Island Act was enacted to help reduce overall global emissions. Global was in italics in your testimony, regarding the global issue of climate change. And again, global was in italics. In particular, as described in Professor Roberts' pre-file testimony before the EFSB, on page 10, line 18, the carbon emission reduction goals in the Resilient Rhode Island Act are based on an overarching goal to see the, quote, reduction of worldwide carbon emissions by 80% below 1990 levels by 2050, unquote. And you put worldwide carbon emissions in both italics and boldface, is that right?
That's correct.
Is it fair to say that you're arguing that emissions from the electricity sector should be viewed as a regional issue because, quote, Rhode Island's electricity load is served by, quote, a regional electricity grid? The quote is from page 38, line 7
Yes.
of your testimony.
Yep. Absolutely.
I'm going to read you some additional statements that you did not make or write. For each one, I'm going to ask you if you agree or disagree with the statement. This is the first statement. Because air pollution does not respect state borders, it is properly treated as a regional issue. Do you agree or disagree?
Agree.
This is the next statement. Indeed, it is well understood that CO2 is a global pollutant, such that emission reductions anywhere contribute to the environmental objective of addressing climate change. Do you agree or disagree?
Agree.
The next statement is this. Climate change is a quintessentially global issue. Emissions released anywhere contribute to the problem everywhere. Do you agree or disagree?
As it pertains to CO2 emissions?
Yes.
Agree.
Would it surprise you to learn that each of those statements were made on December 2nd, 2015 by the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection in a brief filed with the Mass Supreme Judicial Court in the Kane case, in which DEP was arguing that in interpreting the GWSA, one should use a consumption-based method of accounting as you're urging this board to do.
So, what was the...
Could you read back the pending question, please?
It surprised you to learn that each of those statements were made on December 2nd, 2015 by the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection in a brief filed with the Mass Supreme Judicial Court in the Kane case, in which DEP is arguing that
I would agree with that statement.
I was asking if you would be surprised to learn that those statements were made in a losing argument to persuade Massachusetts to use your consumption-based method of accounting. Those arguments lost the case.
Objection. He's characterizing a brief that is not before the board. We seriously suspect that characterization is not correct. We would ask that brief be supplied.
Actually, I'm not characterizing the brief, I'm quoting it. And I have the brief here, and I can direct the board to the relevant page numbers. Nothing was characterized, only quoted. Let me make sure I have the right brief. Yes. May take me a while to find the relevant page numbers, but I'm happy to do it. Don't have enough copies for everybody. I didn't think I'd need the brief, but I wasn't going to mark it. It seemed too obvious for argument. Do you have the brief in front of you?
I do.
I will represent to the board that this is a brief filed by Joanne, it's two words, J-O, new word, A-N-N, Shotwell Kaplan, an Assistant Attorney General of Massachusetts, on behalf of the Massachusetts DEP. The caption of the case, as you can see, is the Kane case. The first quotation appears on page 31. We're near the bottom of the page of not footnote but block text. The first quotation
Conveniently already highlighted?
conveniently already highlighted. Because air pollution does not respect state borders, it is properly treated as a regional issue. I didn't characterize that, did I, Mr. Hardy? I read that. You agree? Okay. Let's look at the next one. The next one is on the same page, the beginning of footnote 25. Indeed, it is well understood that CO2 is a global pollutant. Oh no, wrong quote, hold on. Oh no, I got it. Such that emission reductions anywhere contribute to the environmental objective of addressing climate change. Is that right?
Yes.
The third quote comes further in the footnote. The etiology of the quote seems to be an op-ed piece in the Boston Globe by the UN Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon. The quotation is, "Climate change is a quintessentially global issue. Emissions released anywhere contribute to the problem everywhere." Did I read that correctly?
That's what it says.
Was I reading those quotes, or was I characterizing them, Mr. Hardy?
You're reading the quotes.
Thank you. I have no further questions for the witness.
Did we mark the brief? Right? Okay.
Thank you. Mr. Hardy, we've met before. I'm Mike McIlroy, the attorney for Bartlett.
Morning.
Morning. You recall that you did, looks like an update letter on April 22nd, 2016 on PA letterhead. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And you, in calculating, let me back up. You were asked to do some calculations with regard to what the carbon emission reduction would be system-wide, correct?
That's correct.
And you calculated some other things as well, but you used a method to do that, correct?
Yes.
And you had to make some assumptions to do that, correct?
Yes.
And in this letter, on page 6, table 4, you were showing that you assumed an average annual growth rate for 2019 to 2038 in peak demand of 1.2% and an energy of 1.0%, correct?
I don't have the letter in front of me, but that sounds correct, yes.
And then the table has a footnote 8 that says that the peak demand and load growth numbers through 2024 are from the 2015 CELT, C-E-L-T load report. And that's where you got these numbers, correct?
That's correct.
And could you explain again what CELT stands for?
I forget what it stands for, but it's basically it's New England's report where they forecast a number of things, including their expectations around peak demand growth and energy growth for the region.
And do you know what the most recent CELT report is?
I believe.
It's not 15, is it?
No,
Is it 18?
I believe it's 18.
Do you know if these peak demand numbers have decreased from the 15 CELT report to the 18 CELT report?
Subject to check, I believe they've decreased.
Now, in calculating these numbers, again, we're talking about emissions. You had to make certain assumptions about the Clear River Energy Center, correct?
Yes.
One assumption was that it would be licensed for approximately 1,000 megawatts, correct?
That's correct.
Would you agree with me that this board will be unlikely to approve the construction of the Clear River Energy Center without the Clear River Energy Center having secured a capacity supply obligation from ISO New England?
I can't speak for the board. I don't know.
You don't know. What is your experience generally throughout New England about whether licensing boards are approving construction of new gas plants without CSOs?
We had objection. I thought we were here to talk about state energy policy and greenhouse gas emissions associated with this project, should it be approved by this board. Not questions about whether the project is needed, what might happen with regard to what's happening in other markets and so on and so forth. So we object to the question.
Well, the issue is I'm trying to explore his underlying assumption that Invenergy is going to get a permit for a 1,000 megawatt plant, which is crucial to his calculations.
Which I believe is fundamental if the board is going to engage in a hearing today to determine the greenhouse gas emissions potential of this project. We need to assume that the project is functional, is operating. Obviously, if it's not, then it goes without saying.
What I'd like to do is to attack the underlying assumption he's made that there will be a license for a 1,000 megawatt plant.
Well, that's not the subject. That's not why we're here today.
I'm not going into the issue of need. The only point I'd like to make with Mr. Hardy is that the plant does not have a capacity supply obligation for ISO, from ISO for a 1,000 megawatt plant. Therefore, his assumption of a 1,000 megawatt plant in his calculations does not have any basis. Let me rephrase it.
As long as he states that it's based on that, then I think other witnesses can testify regarding that's an inappropriate basis. If they're testifying about capacity obligations and likelihood of building this plant. But I think that this witness is talking about emissions only, and so I think going too far into those assumptions might be a problem.
Let me just ask one question there, the chairperson. Mr. Hardy, you're aware that Energy, or the Clear River Energy Center, only has a capacity supply obligation for 485 megawatts, not 1,000, correct?
Same
Yes.
objection.
Question is fine.
I believe he answered it yes to court reporter. Thank you. And do you have your testimony? Mr. Ellis has been questioning you about.
Yes.
Could you go to page 3, please? And I'm just going to move consecutively through your testimony, so you might as well keep it in front of you.
Okay.
And I'd like to look at the statement you make beginning on line 17 and going through line 19, where you're talking about your analysis, okay?
Okay.
And I'd like to look at the third point that you're making, which is the reason we're here right now discussing this. And it says, correct would lead to significant CO2, NOx, and SO2 emissions reductions in the region, and specifically annual average reduction of 1.01% for CO2, 3.12% for NOx, and 3.35% for SO2 for the New England and New York region in the 2019-2022 timeframe. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
I'd like to talk about a few things in this statement. First, as my brother has pointed out, this was a limited time frame, correct?
Correct.
It's the first 3 or 4 years of operation of the facility, correct?
Yes.
You didn't make any attempt to run it out to the 2035 time frame in the Resilient Rhode Island Act or to the 2050 time frame. You did no calculations for that, correct?
That's correct.
The second point I'd like to make is that what you were looking at was not solely looking at Rhode Island. You were looking at the New England and New York region.
That's correct.
Right. And the third point I'd like to make is that you have amended these numbers based on subsequent changes. Is that correct?
I have.
Right. Do you know how many times you've amended these numbers?
So the numbers that you cited was my original analysis, which was amended in this analysis. So those two, I filed a supplemental analysis, those 3, and then submitted, I believe it's in Energy Exhibit 147. So that would be 4 times.
And the reason you did this is because there were changes in the market that essentially required you to make these new calculations in order for the information to be current.
That's correct.
Right. And for each of the new calculations, the reductions that you were talking about went down each time, correct?
I would have to have them in front of me. I believe the reductions for CO2 stayed pretty much around 1% annually. I would need all the numbers in front of me to say if they consistently went down, but I believe they stayed right around 1%.
I will agree with you that they were around 1%. If you will accept, subject to check, that after each iteration they went slightly down. And if you check that and find that it's not the case, just let us know.
Subject to check, I think that sounds correct.
All right, thank you. And so on page 5 of your testimony, this is an example of that, how you brought in some current numbers, lines 13 through 15, correct?
That's correct.
And so If you look at the CO2 that was on page 3, it was 1.01% average annual average reduction. But on page 5, the first time you reran it, it was down to 0.95%, correct?
Yes, so it was 0.06% lower.
Do you know what the most current number is?
It's in Invenergy 147. I believe it's, again, around 1%. I don't know what it is going out to the hundredths of a percent.
Is it possible to bring up Invenergy 147?
I think we can. You just give us a second.
The CO2 number is confidential?
I have
We could just have 1 second, or a couple of seconds.
You can have a couple of minutes.
Shouldn't take that. I suggest it's just have it.
That's fine.
Next. We've agreed that Mr. Hardy can look at the document and confirm with Mr. McIlroy the percentage number.
I don't believe there's the CO2 reduction actually changed in this one, so I think the latest numbers are actually in the supplemental testimony. No, in 147. Apologies for that.
Is that the supplemental testimony that was filed last week? Or the
No,
The previous one.
The previous one, yes.
37B.
Sorry about that.
I think that's,
Confidential?
No, that's
yeah.
37B.
I don't. Okay.
Just me.
Thank you.
Suggest you look at page 5. Line 15.
I think it's on line 17.
Yes, so that's 0.89%.
All right, so it's down now to 0.89%, correct?
That's correct.
All right, thank you. Now we're back on your direct testimony,
Okay.
page 13. Line 5. You state that you feel it would be inappropriate to report the impacts of CREC on just Rhode Island specifically, correct?
That's correct.
But what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to assume that for the sake of this argument, hypothetically, that we are looking at a generation or production basis for computing the emissions impacts, okay? Hypothetically assume that this board has determined that we're going to use production-based or generation-based, okay?
Okay.
And tell me what you think, roughly, the impact would be of the carbon emissions from this 1,000 megawatt plant would be on Rhode Island.
If you're looking specifically at the state of Rhode Island, the emissions would be higher.
Would they go up by about 30%?
I'm not sure of the percentage, I didn't look at it that way. But, you know, pursuant to that, you know, you're also making an assumption that we're not taking into account the emissions associated with the electricity that Rhode Island imports. That completely gets forgotten in this hypothetical situation.
The hypothetical looks strictly on a generation/production basis.
Yes.
And doing that, you would agree with me that there would be a substantial increase, rather than a percentage, just a substantial increase in carbon emissions on a generation basis in Rhode Island.
It would be higher, yes.
Do you have any reason to doubt the 30% number that Barville's air emissions expert Eric Eppner had in his testimony in terms of the increase?
I have no opinion on it.
Would you agree with me that this board is charged with determining whether or not there is an unacceptable harm to the state of Rhode Island that would result from this plant?
I just believe that's part of their job, yes.
And their focus is on whether there would be unacceptable harm from this plant to the state of Rhode Island, correct? Not the state of New York or Vermont or New Hampshire or any other New England or New York state, correct?
That's correct, although increases in CO2 emissions, regardless of where the location of that increase are, would be harmful to residents of Rhode Island, as they would be harmful to residents everywhere.
Now, have you read the Resilient Rhode Island Act?
I have.
And so you'll agree with me that there are 3 goals set forth in 46-6.2-2. The first is the first target for greenhouse gas emissions reductions is 10% below 1990 levels by 2020, correct?
That sounds correct, yes.
The second is 45% below 1990 levels by 2035, correct?
I believe that's correct.
And the third is 80% below 1990 levels by 2050, correct?
Correct.
Those 1990 levels that are being referenced are the generation of emissions in Rhode Island in 1990, correct?
That's correct.
And so the reduction that is, the reduction goals that are set forth therein are Rhode Island reduction goals, correct?
Correct.
That's all I have. Thank you.
OER has no questions this way.
I'm wondering whether you want us to ask questions or have the cross first.
It's up to you.
I'll ask just a couple because you may want to respond to them when you do the cross. Mr. Hardy, when it comes to percentages, what do you think is significant? Oh, sorry. When it comes to percentages, what would you characterize as significant? What's a significant percentage?
Well, in terms of CO2 reduction, I think 1% is a significant amount.
Okay.
I guess it's all it's all relative. So if we're talking about the impact of one power plant on CO2 emissions, in that context, I think 1% reduction is significant.
Okay. This I think we'll get into later, in particular with Dr. Kuhl. But would you say a lot has changed in the energy picture in the last 3 years?
Yes.
So, and you all get to this in terms of, you all agree that any emissions on a regional basis will decline in out years, even though you only forecast 4 years. Is that right?
That's correct. And if I may, part of the reason that we focused on a limited time period is, as you say, there's a lot that changes. The longer that you grow it in time, you have to make more assumptions about what the electricity grid looks like. So we have the ability to forecast out 20 years. It just, there's more and more assumptions you have to make. So that's why we chose to focus on a smaller time period for our analysis.
Understood. So I'm looking at pre-filed rebuttal, September 1st, 2017, just so everyone can orient, page 20. And that's where you're commenting on Dr. Kuhl's analysis. And
Sorry, what page?
it is page 20 of the pre-filed rebuttal, September 1st, 2017.
Okay.
And I'm also looking at, and I appreciate that Dr. Kuhl's not on the stand yet, but she says, you're commenting on a part of her testimony, which is page 22 of her direct, but let me just read it. She says that by adding CREC to the region's resource mix, the average annual emission rates will therefore decrease. Over the long term, as the generation fleet becomes increasingly cleaner and more efficient, energy from CREC will in turn be displaced by more efficient gas-fired plants if they are constructed, and by renewable resources, which have no fuel costs and little to no emissions. So now I'm looking at your comment, and I'm just trying to figure out when you think that displacement, your initial analysis has now moved forward because of time that's elapsed since this was docketed. And I guess my question is, in terms of reduction in regional emissions over time, which we just said you estimate at 0.89, I believe. When do you think that displacement, when will we cross that line on the graph where CREC emissions would be displaced by more efficient plants or more renewables?
So is it, if I may, is the question at what point in time would CREC no longer
Be displacing dirtier facilities?
I can't give you a date, but I think it would be a significant amount of time, very, very far out in time. We'll routinely run models out 20 years. The efficiency of this plant, is, if it is to be permitted when it comes online, will be, pretty much about the most efficient gas plant. And so, even with a significant amount of renewables coming on, it will still have an impact in reducing emissions pretty significantly far out in time, I would say.
Okay, thanks. I'll hold other questions for now. Thank you.
I'm sorry. Is there a redirect?
I have a few redirect questions. We first pull up the state energy guide, Rhode Island State Energy Plan, Energy 2035, that Mr. Elmer was referring to in his direct testimony. And let me first, I noticed that Mr. Elmer did not move that document into the record as a formal exhibit. I want to just point out that he provided the board with a partial version of that energy plan. The energy plan is about 150 pages. We believe the entire exhibit, the entire plan, I should say, should be the exhibit for the board to review. We have agreed, Mr. Elmer and I have conferred at the break, and we have agreed that we can make the full Rhode Island State Energy Plan an exhibit by stipulation without any objection.
Mr. Shore is accurately reflecting our discussion. No, I was moving the other two in as full. I believe we had sufficient foundation for that, and that Mr. Am I correct, Mr. Shore, that you did not object?
No objection. These are, one was the 2016 ISO New England Air Emissions Report, and the other was, I don't have it right in front of me.
The ISO New England two-page document, New England Power Grid 2017-2018 profile.
Thank you.
Okay, those are all.
Mr. Hardy, do you have the energy state energy plan, Energy 2035 for you there? Or at least
Yes.
a portion of it?
Yes.
Could you turn to page 12? Now, at the top of the page on 12, there's a subject that's called electricity. I believe this section of the plan is talking about the electricity market. And I want you just to look at the first line with me. And it talks about, I'm quoting from it here, it says, the electricity consumed in Rhode Island homes, businesses, and institutions is generated at power plants, transported through a network of high voltage transmission lines, and distributed via local poles and wires to end users, period. And then it goes on to talk about how the Rhode Island Electric Grid is connected to a larger regional power grid composed of more than 350 generating resources, and so on and so forth. Do you see that reference?
Yes.
Am I correct that the plan is referring to the electricity that is consumed in Rhode Island, not electricity that is generated in Rhode Island, in the reference to the electric market there?
That's correct.
Please turn to page 13, the next page, halfway down. This is the section of the plan that talks about the natural gas power component. Am I correct that on the second paragraph of that description of the natural gas component of the region's power mix, am I correct that this, look at the second sentence, start there, where it says, the vast majority of natural gas consumed in Rhode Island arrives via pipelines developed and operated by the Algonquin Gas Transmission Company and the Tennessee Gas Pipeline Company. When you see the phrase, the vast majority of natural gas consumed in Rhode Island, how do you interpret that phrase in the context of the discussion that you had with Mr. Elmer over generation versus consumption-based emissions?
Objection. Carbon dioxide emissions in the electricity sector and the gas sector are addressed in substantially different ways, and what Mr. Hardy has testified about is proper calculation of emissions from the electricity sector.
That's exactly the point that we were trying to make, that we're trying to make through this witness. Please answer, unless there's a...
I don't understand the objection.
We've been having extended discussions about the proper methodology, consumption-based versus production-based, for counting carbon emissions from the electricity sector. Natural gas and transportation are part of the state energy guide plan, but we're not talking about tailpipe emissions, we're not talking about electrifying RIPTA buses, we're not talking about the Algonquin gas pipeline, we're not talking about methane emissions, we're talking about proper calculation of emissions from the electricity sector and from electric power plants.
I think as long as you qualify what exactly it is you're asking about.
I'm asking, Mr. Hardy, I'm asking you about the role of natural gas and the electricity market in the region and in Rhode Island. And I'm asking you to confirm that the state energy plan element, Energy 25, on page 12 and on page 13, the section that deals with the electricity market is referring to the natural gas, the amount of the natural gas consumed in Rhode Island. Is that the proper, is that the reference that's in that document?
Yes, so I guess just to clarify, I mean, on page 13, it's talking about natural gas that's brought into the state for consumption for both the electric sector and thermal energy, essentially heating. In this case, clarification, yes, all of that natural gas is imported into the state for consumption.
And on page 22, if you look at that, the top of page 22, that says electricity, correct?
Yes.
And am I correct that we're talking here about the Rhode Island's electric sector comprising all end-user electric consumption in the state? Do you see that?
Yes.
And you see the second sentence where it says electric demand is served by power plants located in state as well as generating resources in other neighboring states. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then it goes on to conclude, due to the regional nature of New England's electric grid. Am I reading that correctly?
Yes.
Now, would you please pull up, I don't believe you have it in front of you, but if our technical assistant can scroll to page, I believe it is page 68. Sorry, page 66. So the witness can see the reference. Just give you a second to find. Okay, thank you. Let's look at the term. Let's look at the section of this page here. Which, it's under the heading "Mobilize Capital and Reduce Costs." I'd like you to look at the third sentence, which I will read it here. It says that the plan recognizes that achieving a least cost energy future depends on a proper accounting of the lifetime net costs and benefits of energy procurement in all sectors. Do you see that?
Yes.
Okay. And do you interpret these references throughout this document that we've referred to that reference the amount of electricity consumed in Rhode Island to represent a consumption-based method of accounting for the emissions associated with carbon emissions, or a production-based accounting method?
Be consumption-based.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
through notes up here. Are there any additional questions?
You have a couple if you want me to go first, or? On page, if you, CLF 16, if you still have it, it's the Energy 2035 excerpt.
Yep.
Page 13. Right under the heading that says natural gas. The second sentence. It says, nearly all in-state electric generation relies on natural gas as a fuel source. Do you see that?
Yes.
And you agree with that?
Yes.
I'm just trying to get my head around generation versus consumption-based accounting as it specifically relates on the ground. So I'm going to tell you what I think this means on the ground, and you correct me if you think that I'm wrong. Let's look at this site out in Barrville where Invenergy proposes to erect this facility, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And on that site, right now, it's forest, correct? It's forested land. It's got trees on it.
Sure.
Trees absorb carbon dioxide, correct?
Yes.
And they give off oxygen. That's what's happening out on this site right now, correct?
Yes.
If this plant were to be built on this site, then the potential to emit carbon dioxide in a year would be about 7 billion pounds, correct?
Potential? Yes.
That would all be emitted into the air over the town of Barrville, correct?
In terms of CO2 emissions, I mean,
Yes.
being emitted into the air, yes.
Yes.
It's not a, CO2 is not a local pollutant. Any CO2 emitted into the system, regardless of where it is.
I get you, but from this plant in Barrville, on this site, the CO2 would go up the stacks and into the air directly over the town of Barrville, correct?
Sure.
Now, if you use the generation or production method of accounting, that 7 billion pounds of CO2 would be counted in the state of Rhode Island, correct?
Correct.
If you used the consumption method of accounting, because Rhode Island system-wide only uses 6% of the energy, you would only count 6% of that 7 billion pounds, correct?
No, that's not correct.
So how would you characterize that?
You're still, what's being emitted is still the full amount. So whatever that number is, if we're talking a hypothetical amount based on some number in an air permit, or if we're talking about the projection of what is actually going to be, or what is projected to be emitted. The question is, how do you account for those emissions? So generation-based accounting just looks at it and says, if it's emitted within this area, then that's how you account for it.
It's going to take the 7 billion
Yes.
or whatever number.
Consumption-based also looks at it, and it's going to count that amount, whether it's 7 billion or 5, whatever the number is, but let's just use your 7 billion. It's also going to account for that, but it's going to look at, okay, 7 billion are being emitted here, and it's producing power to meet electricity needs for the region, and that may be displacing a less efficient plant. I mean, you could look at, plants that are on the list on the same page that you referenced, or plants in the system that are much less efficient, that are emitting significantly more carbon. Okay, so you're still counting those emissions, but you're looking at, well, what is the impact on the system? You have other less efficient plants that are now running less and emitting less carbon. So when you look at the carbon reductions, it's looking at the total system and adding that up.
I understand that. So what I'm struggling with is, and correct me if I'm wrong, it seems to me that if CREC is permitted, that what's going to happen is there's going to be a potential to emit of about 7 billion pounds per year of carbon dioxide emitted into the air over the town of Barrville. And that you're saying that's a benefit for the system of about 1%, something less than 1%, correct?
That's correct.
So the burden on Barrville is that it will have approximately 7 billion pounds of carbon dioxide emitted into its air every year to get a benefit for the entire New England system of a less than 1% reduction in carbon. Is that correct?
It's not,
Then you-
no, it's not correct, because I think the fundamental issue that we're missing is location does not matter for CO2 emissions. It does not matter where the CO2 is emitted. If our CO2 emissions continue to rise globally, that is negative for all of us. If we take steps to reduce CO2 emissions, that's a benefit for all of us. Location, it does not matter when it comes to CO2 emissions.
If you're trying to reduce emissions in Rhode Island, the question is, how much of that 7 billion do you assign to Rhode Island? Do you assign 100% under the generation method, or do you assign only 6% under the consumption method? Is that not correct?
This is the exact problem.
But first answer the question and then explain.
Okay.
Is that not correct?
Can you ask the question again?
Yes. Could you read it back, please?
That's not correct.
Feel free to explain.
So under generation accounting, you would assign all of it to Rhode Island.
100%.
100%. There is no 6% that you would assign to Rhode Island. But the fundamental issue with that is CO2 legislation or the reduction of CO2, you cannot look at it just on a state basis. That's a limited view that can lead to incorrect conclusions.
But we already established that the Resilient Rhode Island Act does look at it on a Rhode Island basis, correct?
But the Resilient Rhode Island Act also has a language that talks about working within the region, working with other states on putting together a plan to reduce emissions for the region. CO2 reduction cannot be done on a state-by-state basis. It just can't.
But it is being done on a state-by-state basis, isn't it?
But there's collaboration. You have the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which has, all of the states in New England, including other states on the eastern seaboard that are looking that are making real carbon reductions under that program.
I don't disagree with that. But we've already established that the reduction goals set forth in the Resilient Rhode Island Act are reduction goals for the state of Rhode Island, correct?
Goals are not the same as statutes.
Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. That's all.
Am I correct, Mr. Hardy, that in response to a question by Mr. McIlroy just a moment ago, you said, his question was, under a production basis of accounting, if this plant is built, Rhode Island carbon emissions would go up. Is that right?
That's correct.
Am I correct that a moment ago in response to Mr. McIlroy, you said, quote, you cannot, accounting for carbon emissions cannot be done on a statewide basis, unquote?
Yes, I think that's a limited way of looking at carbon reduction to do it on a state-by-state level. I think you need regional, not, the more collaboration across the region that you have, the more meaningful targets and reduction you can put in place. Absolutely.
But you did say that carbon emission reductions cannot be done on a statewide basis.
Yeah, and that was in reference to this whole discussion of production versus consumption-based accounting.
Isn't it a fact that that exact argument, carbon emissions cannot be done on a statewide basis, was the Mass DEP's argument in Massachusetts under the Global Warming Solutions Act, and that Massachusetts has rejected that argument completely?
Objection. First, I think it's just, we didn't explore any of this in redirect questions. We have also object that,
I think we did.
well, I mean, so Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court case that Mr. Elmer is referencing was not a case for sport on redirect question.
This is a really simple yes or no question that will be of keen interest to the EFSB in the outcome of this case.
Well, I think our objection is that he's characterizing the decision of that case, which we challenge and dispute if we want to have an argument about it. He's asking for...
No, we can argue about it later.
Yeah.
But, well, I understand your position.
And he's asking-
I'll allow the question.
Could you read back the pending question, please?
Isn't it a fact that that exact argument, carbon emissions cannot be done on a statewide basis, was the Mass DEP's argument in Massachusetts under the global warming solutions act, and Massachusetts has rejected that argument?
Just objection that calls for a legal conclusion.
You may answer the question.
I don't know.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Can I boil down your testimony as follows? From a production-based methodology, emissions in Rhode Island go up significantly and in the region go down. So that's the first part. Is that a fair summary?
Well, I guess I would say under production-based accounting, emissions in Rhode Island would go up. Under consumption-based accounting, they go down.
Okay, I was asking a different question, but it's an obvious answer. Under production-based, they go up, but are you saying that on a regional level, if we're still sticking with a production-based methodology, they won't go down? That's only consumption-based?
Yeah, it's essentially you would be, once you, or if you're looking at it on a regional level, I think you're really looking at it on a consumption basis.
So from a consumption-based methodology, finish that sentence.
Emissions would go down.
In Rhode Island
Yes,
and in the region?
yes.
Okay. All right, thanks. I think some of the other questions I have will address with the other witnesses, and I know you'll come back to us. Thank you.
No further questions for this witness?
No further questions. One from here.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.